Hey everybody, how are you today? So now we're going to finish talking about basically the role of science and sociology. And remember, we were talking about the 7 steps of the scientific method and how ultimately it's about defining a problem, reviewing the literature, forming a hypothesis, choosing a research design, collecting data, analyzing that data, and then finally presenting conclusions. So, when it comes to the 4th step of the scientific method, which is all about the research process and choosing a research design, a scientist, a sociologist has to decide, what would be the best way to collect data to basically test one's hypothesis and to try to figure out, what's really going on here? What's really causing this problem? What may be some potential solutions to this problem? So last time we talked about the role of surveys and how important it is to figure out if you want to have just a survey where you're collecting just pure quantitative data. So, giving out a survey digitally or in person with open-ended, closed-ended questions which are neutral, not really biased, and perhaps collecting some qualitative data as well, which is focusing more on description and information. Perhaps having an interview component in there where people can kind of explain their answers. And just really, when you're collecting all this information, to think about the population size as well. So, the population, if you're giving a survey out to high school students at Geneseo, that would be the population would be Geneseo high school students, and then you'd be trying to get a random sample. So it would be every third student, and you'd want it to be a representative sample where basically you were getting just as many sophomores, freshmen, juniors, seniors involved in that study. You would not want to have just seniors conduct a study or, for example, just freshmen conduct a study. So now we're going to move on to talking about the next type of way of really kind of having a research study set up. And this one isn't really a typical research design. Basically, in some situations, it might be possible to really not have any kind of experiment or give out any survey. It's more so a comparative kind of analysis where you can use what's called the historical method. And you can look at past examples, research, experiments, and basically gain information that you need that may apply to your hypothesis and may solve your problem. You could look at earlier studies and try to figure out, about what might be going on there. So historical method could be something that, you're looking to try to get information like Durkheim, he would have been looking at in terms of how many people had committed suicide, had they ruled it as a suicide, what would be the factors that might have been led to it. So unemployment records, people who were perhaps in mental institutions, mental hospitals to try to get help, suffering from depression, people on medication, all of that would be part of the historical method to try to gain more information about, what was happening in that society. In terms of content analysis is also something that sociologists might do. And it's more so about, really looking at how prevalent a problem is in society. And so they might look at how many times a situation occurs to try to figure things out. So sociologists don't always just study problems. Remember, in the field of symbolic interactionism, in the lecture from earlier this week, we talked about the 3 sociological perspectives and how some people are functionalists and they kind of see the glass half full. And there are the conflict perspective, people who focus on the problems in our society. And then there's a symbolic interactionist, that just look at kind of the gestures, the symbols that are used in the everyday life, how people get along, how they interact with each other. And there are symbolic interactionists out there who study things like impression management, which is a field that was first created by a sociologist called Irving Goffman. And impression managers basically say that people are obsessed with social media, with portraying themselves in a certain light, with trying to convince others that they're happy, they're put together, they're beautiful, their children are well behaved, they're successful, they're well loved by others. And of course, celebrities, social influencers and just other celebrities. They hire people to manage their social media profiles so that they appear in a certain light. So content analysis in this case would be, sociologists would keep track of how many likes does a certain celebrity have, how many times do they hashtag a particular item, you know, how many times do they wear certain clothes, mention certain designers, music, whatever it is. So they basically keep track of that to try to figure out, how does this person kind of cultivate this image of themselves? How do they show the world, one side of themselves through social media? And they would keep track of basically what kind of pictures they post. Is it about their charity work or music they listen to or movies they're in or clothes they wear, how they help others, what is it? And, it's just kind of a tracking method, which has become very easy to do in today's world because computers basically can track all that kind of stuff. Now let's talk about some of the more common research designs. So in class for hybrid learners, we're going to be completing page 1 and 2, or I should say page 3, questions 1 and 2. And so if you're a remote learner and you're listening to this video, which I assume you are because you're a remote learner and you should be, you're going to be working in that this week as well. As you read page 1 and 2 and do questions 1 and 2 on page 3, you're going to be learning about a sociologist who wanted to learn more about how people kind of get along in a community, how they interact, what role drugs, kind of an illegal economy, violence, gangs play in this society. And so the individual decides to basically kind of go undercover and live amongst the people for a while because, going back to the ideas of Max Weber and Wittgenstein, right, you really don't understand a group of people until you've walked a mile into their shoes because we all have our own perspectives. The sociological perspective challenges you to look at the world in a different light, to see the strange and the familiar. And so participant observation really kind of truly supports that mentality that you're going to become directly involved in the situation being studied to truly understand those people. So we see that sometimes scientists do that, as far as trying to, like Jane Goodall went and studied apes and different animal species to truly kind of get to know those people and those species and live with them and see their behavior on a daily basis. At first, of course, they were quite shy. They acted differently around her, but in time they got used to her. And so this was kind of what happened with the case of the sociologist as well. And he kind of went too far, got in too deep, and really kind of started to change who he was as he became a member of this group. But that's kind of participant observation, as you're really kind of a member of it. Detached observation is more so when you're watching from afar. People don't necessarily know that they're being studied. So if you go into, different fields, as far as like you want to go into being a daycare worker, working with children, even being a teacher. I can remember that one of my experiments for psychology class and for teaching was I had to observe children. And of course, there's participant observation where you actually go to a middle school, a high school, as part of your teacher training. And first you watch the kids, you get to know the kids, you help the kids, and then you train the kids and you teach. You basically mentor them, and then you actually teach a lesson. But there's also detached observation. I can remember doing this at Purdue where it was younger elementary school age children, but they had no idea we were watching them. And it was basically looked like a big mirror in their classroom, but it's a two-way mirror. And we would watch them play and we would observe them and see, do they get along with each other? Do they bully each other? Do they listen to the teacher? Who misbehaves? And when people don't think anyone is watching, they're more likely to act truly like themselves. So when it comes to an observational study, a sociologist, a scientist of any kind has to decide, what kind of data they're looking for and, what kind of experiment do they want to set up. Detached observation is helpful, but it only goes so far because you can only watch people for a short period of time without them really knowing that you're there, and you only gain access to certain types of information. If you want to truly get the whole story and kind of watch them, for a longer period of time and really get involved with them, that's participant observation. Going along with this mentality, there's also something called a case study. where you may study one person or a group of people for a long period of time, where you're really trying to get the ins and outs of them and figure out kind of what they're doing, how they're acting, how they're behaving. It's a very kind of intense method of study. It might be multi-generational, so it might, cover multiple years of their lives. It usually gives off lots of helpful information. It kind of really paints the picture of what people do and say on a regular basis. Some of the most famous case studies have been about children and their education process and the environment that they were raised in and how it kind of affects them over time, and did their early childhood experiences in education impact who they became later. Now, moving on, the fourth of the basic research designs that a scientist or sociologist may pick from is, of course, an experiment, which I think is the one that we're all the most comfortable with and familiar with. And in an experiment, as they're collecting, some kind of quantitative or numerical data, as opposed to qualitative research, which is more focused on descriptions, case studies, detached observation, participant observation. When we're doing a true experiment and it's looking for that quantitative data, you're going to have an experimental group and a control group. The control group is the group that's not exposed to the independent variable. An experimental group is the group that is exposed to the independent variable. So, for example, if it was a science class, and they're trying to figure out when it comes to the study that you're going to be looking at later this week, in the ASA ethics assignment, they talk about how a group of people suffered from syphilis, other people did not suffer from syphilis, and they were curious to see, how syphilis ravaged the body, how it impacted people, and then if they were given medical treatments, how those medical treatments helped people. Would they help cure syphilis or not? Did syphilis impact African Americans versus, Caucasian Americans any differently? And it was a totally unethical study because it really deceived people. It never gave them access to any medicine to improve. They didn't really truly have their informed consent when they were, being involved in that study. But in this case, the group that would be receiving medicine to help them, that would obviously be the experimental group. If a new drug is coming out, obviously here in the age of COVID, as they're coming out with, vaccines and such, and they're testing other drugs to see if they're effective at combating the virus once they have it. If you are in the group that is receiving the actual medicine, that's the independent variable. You are in the experimental group. If you're in the group that's just receiving the placebo, you're not actually receiving any kind of medicine, that's the control group. You're not being exposed to the independent variable, the variable that changes. Variable is obviously the factor that's being changed or controlled in some way. And when it comes to setting up an experiment, for the most part, there's usually what we call a double blind, where people don't really know. There could be a single blind where the people don't know what group they're being put in, but the experimenters do. Sometimes it's a double blind, and the people who are giving out the medicine don't know either, because they want to make sure that those people don't show any kind of bias in their behavior or their treatment towards groups, and double blinds are pretty common. But ultimately, it's, experiments are important to try to see how people behave in different situations. And when we're thinking about experiments, it could be all sorts of things. Sociologists, obviously, most of the time, they're not going to be doing experiments with medicine. One of the most famous experiments that we'll talk about kind of here later in the year is a guy by the name of Albert Bandura. And he wants to see, how children behave if they watch people play violently. And so he has one group of children who gets to watch, nice little happy fairy tales and cartoons where everybody gets along and plays nice. And he watches people play nicely, and then the children play nicely for the most part. And then he has another group where the children are exposed to more violent television. They watch people play it very rough. And then lo and behold, when it comes time to play on their own, the children play very violently and very rough. And so it's all about the idea that children imitate what they see, especially from an early age on. That's where we get this mentality of monkey see, monkey do. And yeah, it's a whole experimental group where the children are divided up, and you've got the experimental group who are being exposed to the independent variable, which is how does basically violent television and violent acts impact children, compared to the control group, which is not receiving any of that behavior. So they're more focused on, for the part of sociologists, not like an experiment with medicine, but more so with violence and how children play and behave and the impact of television and things like that, and just kind of individual and group behavior, children being that group of focus. And we'll actually watch, I think, that video clip here in a couple chapters. Now, the other thing to kind of focus on when we are talking about experiments is causation versus correlation. And there's definitely a difference between causation and correlation. So, for example, when it comes to, causation and correlation, so we need to also talk a little bit about causation and correlation. So when it comes to causation and correlation, sometimes people draw false conclusions about data that are not entirely true. So, for example, when it comes to kind of the connection between data, sometimes people draw the false conclusion. So if you look at the picture I've got at the bottom there, okay, you've got Mr. Sun and it's a sunny day. And so naturally, since it's a sunny day, if ice cream is outside, it is going to melt if you leave it out in the sun. And so clearly, if it's hot out and you leave ice cream in the sun, it will melt. And you can prove that because you can look at the scientific properties of ice cream. If it's a hot sunny day and you stay out in the sun for a long period of time without any kind of shade or sunscreen, yet again, it is possible that you will get a sunburn, and you can do the experiment, you can collect data, you can prove this. Okay, so there is clearly a cause and effect factor here, where basically we see if there is an increase of sun and heat, you will see an increase of melted ice cream. Okay, so it shows that connection. If there is an increase in heat and sun that day, there could be an increase in sunburns nationwide. But just because there is an increase in melted ice cream does not mean that there will be an increase in sunburns. Okay, it's not like those two things, one causes the other. So they don't really have any true connection. Sometimes people will go and they'll look at the data and they'll say, ooh, wait, clearly there's an increase in one and there's an increase in another, and they both happen to be present in our world. And so perhaps one causes the other. But when we think about it, you know that to be ridiculous. You know that just because there's melted ice cream and people getting sunburns, they don't have any true connection to each other. There's what we call like data correlation, where we see that those are other factors which are present and in some ways are connected, but it's not like one causes the other by any means. There's all sorts of other what we think of as Z factors happening. So, for example, it could be that, really and truly, a student has perfect attendance and receives all A's. Those two factors perhaps are correlated or connected, but just because a student receives a perfect attendance award does not guarantee that they will have straight A's. A kid can come to school every day and they could actually be asleep. So just because you're there at school doesn't actually mean that you're just like absorbing the knowledge through your brain and learning everything. It's more so the Z factor, where kids who are more likely to be in school are there to ask questions. They'll feel guilt if they don't do their homework. They'll get help from their peers and their teacher. So there's other factors going on. So is perfect attendance and straight A's correlated or connected? Yes. But does straight A's, will that naturally occur just because of perfect attendance? No, perfect attendance does not cause that. And so what we say about this is something called spurless correlations, meaning sometimes people draw inaccurate conclusions because of the data points. So there's a whole website book about what we call the spurious correlations. So here's a great one. And in this spurless correlations, we've got the number of people who drowned by falling into a pool. There's data which shows that it correlates with the amount of films that the actor Nicolas Cage has appeared in. There's also data which shows that the per capita cheese consumption, it is correlated to the number of people who died becoming tangled in their bed sheets, which I'm actually like appalled that many people, that's the number in black there, in 2009 died by being tangled in their bed sheets. I'm real confused by this, and I'm actually real worried for these people. I'm also, kind of confused that happens at all. Here's a great one. I love this one. Okay, so this one is trying to see, so look at these two different factors here. We've got the amount of margarine consumed, which is in black, and then the divorce rate in Maine, which is in red. And so when you look at the data points, they look so similar. And so sometimes people think that, you know, they are in some way truly connected, but that's not the case. It's not that one causes the other, and it's not even that they truly might have a connection. There's all sorts of other Z factors out there which are the real connection. And so don't try to like draw connections where there are none. But people try to do that all the time in the world today, which is where you get a lot of the bogus news out there in the world, because people are just drawing inaccurate conclusions which are not based off of science. You need science in our world. You can't just assume that there's a connection in Maine because of the amount of margarine that people eat. It has no real factor on people's lives, but that's what they're trying to say here. So that's kind of an overview of the last of our kind of different, methods that could be used to truly, kind of gain data, and then to collect that data and analyze that data and then draw a conclusion as you're going through the research process. And I think a lot of that hopefully was kind of a review for you, because it is all stuff you've learned in science before. And, it's just really used in sociology as well. The last thing to mention here is that as you're going through the ASA ethics worksheet, it talks a lot about how there's different ethics in sociology, and as sociologists are conducting experiments, they have to be confidential. So they're not supposed to be telling the public or anyone involved the names of the people who were in the study, so that if some kind of harm came to those people, people would not be embarrassed. They would feel that this was a secretive, private thing, that if they wanted to tell people about their involvement, they could, but that's up to them. People should not be in any way deceived during a study unless it is for the outcome of the study, and then they should be told as soon as possible about why they were deceived and how. So there should be no kind of, any kind of deception happening. In the study that you're learning about this week with the syphilis experiment and those participants, that study went on for 40 years, and it's ridiculous because they were deceived. They did not really and truly ever get told what was truly happening to them. There's also the importance of informed consent. You need to tell people what's happening in the study, give them an overview of what will happen to them to truly get their permission before the study is conducted. And most of the experiments that happened years ago, this never happened either. And of course, when people don't follow these guidelines, studies can go wrong, they can be unfortunate, accidents can happen, they can have long-term consequences on people's physical and mental health, which is what we'll be learning about more so this year. So have a great day, guys. That kind of wraps up the chapter. We'll be moving to review questions, reviewing for the test next week. Later.